The city council chambers smelled like old wood and fluorescent lighting, 200 faces packed into rows designed for half that number. News cameras perched along the back wall, red lights blinking like patient predators. Victoria Ashford stood at the center podium in a charcoal Armani suit that cost more than most people in this room earned in 3 months. Her blonde hair swept into a twist that suggested control, precision, the kind of woman who didn't tolerate mistakes or second guessing. Behind her, 5 lawyers in identical navy suits formed a wall of expensive credibility. The double doors at the rear creaked open. Heads turned. A black man in his mid-30s walked down the center aisle wearing a building inspector's uniform that had seen better days, the city seal patch fraying at the edges. He carried a battered leather briefcase that looked like it had survived a decade of basement archives and rainstorms. Victoria's eyes tracked him with the clinical interest of someone identifying an insect that had wandered into her peripheral vision. Marcus Chen reached the front table and set down his briefcase with a thud that echoed too loud in the sudden silence. He didn't look at Victoria, not yet. He opened the case and extracted a single manila folder, placed it on the table, then turned to face the room. "Mrs. Ashford, I'm here to present evidence that Ashford Properties violated 127 building codes over 6 years. Resulting in 4 deaths. Victoria's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind her eyes. The recognition of a threat that hadn't announced itself properly, hadn't followed protocol. "You? The building inspector?" Marcus reached into his briefcase again, pulled out a second folder, this one thicker. "Former FBI senior analyst, MIT structural engineering. And yes, your building inspector." The room erupted in murmurs. Camera operators adjusted their angles. Victoria's lead attorney leaned forward to whisper something urgent in her ear, but she waved him off with a flick of her wrist that suggested this was beneath concern, a procedural hiccup that would resolve itself with the right phone call. Marcus opened the second folder and began laying out photographs across the table. Cracked foundations, exposed rebar rusted down to skeletal fragments, a balcony that had become a crime scene. The screen behind him flickered to life. Someone in the back had set up his presentation without being asked. The first slide showed blueprints, side by side, submitted versus actual construction. Red circles highlighted where load-bearing walls had been replaced with drywall, where steel beams had been swapped for aluminum, where concrete specified at 4,000 psi had been poured at half that strength. Victoria's smile finally cracked at the edges. The words on the screen dissolved, replaced by a title card in stark white letters, 6 weeks earlier. Marcus woke at 5:47 a.m. to the sound of pipes groaning in the walls of his apartment, a studio on the 4th floor of a building that charged $875 a month for the privilege of hearing your neighbors' arguments and cooking smells. The morning light came through a window that faced a brick wall 3 feet away, turning everything the color of old dishwater. On the nightstand, a framed photograph. Sarah, gap-toothed smile, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. 3 years since the car accident. Some mornings he still reached for her side of the bed before remembering. In the corner, Maya slept in a twin bed pushed against the wall, her science textbook still open on her chest. 8 years old, 3rd grade, already asking questions about structural engineering when other kids were still figuring out multiplication. She had Sarah's smile, the same way of tilting her head when she was working through a problem. Marcus checked his phone. Bank account, $127. Rent due in 6 days. He'd taken the building inspector job 2 years ago after leaving the FBI, after a case involving missing children had burrowed so deep into his skull that he'd started seeing threats in every shadow, every stranger's face. The pay was a 60% cut from his analyst salary, but it came with regular hours and the ability to sleep at night. Mostly. He made coffee in a pot that had belonged to Sarah, scrambled eggs in a pan that had been a wedding gift. Maya emerged from sleep in stages, rubbing her eyes, climbing into the kitchen chair that wobbled because he kept meaning to fix it and never did. "Daddy," Mrs. Chen in 3B said, "our building makes weird noises at night, like creaking." Marcus paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "All buildings make noises, baby. Thermal expansion, wind load, settling. But is it safe?" He looked at his daughter, at the trust in her eyes that assumed he had answers, that assumed the world made sense if you just understood the right equations. "Yes, baby, it's safe." But he made a mental note to check the foundation on his next day off, just in case. The Department of Buildings and Safety occupied the 3rd floor of a municipal complex that smelled like decades of floor wax and bureaucratic exhaustion. Marcus shared a cubicle with 3 other inspectors, all of whom had learned not to ask why an MIT graduate with a federal background was spending his days checking outlet spacing and handrail heights. His supervisor, a man named Gerald who'd been doing this job since before Marcus was born, had stopped trying to understand it and settled for appreciating that Marcus never called in sick and wrote reports that actually cited code sections. This morning, Gerald dropped a file on Marcus's desk with the weight of something he didn't want to be holding. Ashford Riverside, luxury condos going up on the waterfront. They're requesting final inspection before a certificate of occupancy. Marcus opened the file. Ashford Properties. He recognized the name from a dozen other projects scattered across the city, most of them in neighborhoods where people didn't have lawyers on retainer or city councilors on speed dial. The blueprints looked standard. 12 stories, mixed residential and commercial, the kind of building that got profiled in architecture magazines and promised to revitalize the waterfront. He drove to the site in his city-issued sedan, the one with 140,000 miles, and a check engine light that had been on for 2 years. The building rose against the morning sky like a promise of something better, all glass and steel and clean lines that suggested money, success, the kind of life where buildings didn't creak at night and bank accounts had more than 3 digits. The site manager met him at the entrance, a white man in his 50s wearing a hard hat that looked like it had never touched actual construction dust. Behind him, workers moved with the practiced efficiency of people who knew their roles and stuck to them. Marcus started in the basement, working his way up. Foundation, load-bearing walls, electrical, plumbing, HVAC. By the 3rd floor, he'd found his first violation: improper spacing on seismic anchor bolts. By the 5th floor, he'd found 6 more. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to fail inspection. Enough to require expensive fixes before any certificates got signed. He was documenting a crack in the foundation wall, measuring its width with digital calipers, when heels clicked across the concrete behind him. Expensive heels, the kind that cost more than his monthly grocery budget. Victoria Ashford materialized like she'd been teleported from a different dimension, one where construction sites came with catered coffee and nobody's shoes got dusty. Her perfume reached him first, something that probably had a French name and came in a bottle the size of a shot glass. She extended a hand that had never changed a tire or unclogged a drain. Mrs. Ashford, Marcus Chen, building inspector. Her handshake was brief, professional, the grip of someone who'd learned to navigate rooms full of men who underestimated her. "I'm sure you're doing your best with," she paused, let her eyes travel over his worn clipboard and city-issued jacket, limited training. "But my engineers graduated from Cornell." The site manager appeared at her elbow like he'd been waiting for his cue. "Maybe you missed something, buddy. This isn't Section 8 housing. We follow standards here." Marcus kept his voice level, his face neutral in the way he'd learned during FBI interrogations, when showing reaction meant losing control. Code 1700 4.3 requires anchor bolts at 16-inch spacing. These are at 24. "Ma'am, I'll need to file a violation report." Victoria's smile could have frozen water. "Of course you will. How thorough." Her employees exchanged glances that Marcus had seen before, in rooms where he was the only black face. In meetings where his credentials got questioned despite being printed on his business card. He packed his equipment with deliberate care, made his notes in handwriting that would survive legal scrutiny, and walked out with his dignity intact because dignity was the one thing nobody could take unless you handed it to them. Back at the office, he wrote the report with the precision of someone who understood that every word would be read by people looking for reasons to dismiss it. Rosa Martinez, a Latina inspector in her 50s who'd been doing this job since Marcus was in high school, leaned over his cubicle divider. "You write like a lawyer, Marcus. That's not a compliment in this office. I pay attention, that's all." She lowered her voice. "Ashford has friends, the kind that make phone calls when they don't like inspection results. Be careful." After she left, Marcus pulled up the city database on his computer and typed in Ashford Properties. The search returned 83 results. He started clicking through them, one by one, looking for patterns the way he'd been trained to look for patterns in financial crimes and missing person cases. By the time his shift ended, he'd found what he was looking for. 73 building violations over 6 years, all in low-income neighborhoods, all cleared by inspectors who'd retired early or transferred to different departments. 4 addresses flagged with incident reports: balcony collapse, 2 deaths, July 2019. Fire escape, structural failure, 1 death, March 2021. Roof collapse during storm, 1 death, October 2023. The foundation cracks he documented at Riverside matched the pattern from 3 other Ashford buildings. Same width, same angle, same location relative to load-bearing walls. Not random settling, not thermal stress. Design flaws, repeated across multiple sites, ignored across multiple inspections. Marcus sat back in his chair and looked at the numbers on his screen until they stopped being numbers and became something else. A system, a pattern, a choice someone had made over and over for 6 years. He printed the report, slid it into his briefcase, and drove home through traffic that moved like sludge. Maya was already asleep when he got there, her babysitter letting herself out with a tired smile. Marcus stood in the doorway of their apartment and looked at his daughter, at the cracked ceiling above her bed, at the walls that he now knew belonged to a building owned by an Ashford subsidiary. His phone buzzed. Email from Victoria Ashford's office, sent through the city's contractor portal. "Your services at Riverside are no longer needed. We'll request a different inspector for reevaluation." Marcus deleted the email and opened his laptop. If they wanted a different inspector, that meant his report had mattered. If his report had mattered, that meant they were worried. If they were worried, that meant there was something worth worrying about. He started a new document and titled it Pattern Analysis. Ashford Properties, 2018-2024. What Marcus didn't know, as he typed through the night with his daughter sleeping 3 feet away, was that Victoria Ashford was sitting in her corner office overlooking the waterfront, looking at his personnel file on her computer screen. MIT, FBI, structural engineering specialist. Not the kind of inspector who made mistakes or accepted explanations. She picked up her phone and dialed the city commissioner's direct line, the one she'd been given after her company donated $200,000 to his re-election campaign. I need that inspector removed. Find something. Maya came home from school 3 days later with tear tracks dried on her cheeks and a note from the principal that Marcus read twice before he trusted himself to speak. The incident report described playground harassment, specifically targeting students who lived in what another third grader had called the poor people buildings that might fall down. Maya had defended herself and 2 other children with enough volume that a teacher had intervened. "Daddy, is our building going to collapse?" Marcus knelt so their eyes were level, his hands on her shoulders feeling the small tremors of a child trying to be brave. He wanted to say yes, wanted to tell her the truth about rebar specifications and concrete strength and profit margins that treated human safety like a line item to be minimized. Instead, he pulled her close and felt her heartbeat against his chest. "No, baby. Daddy's going to make sure of it." That night, after Maya fell asleep, clutching her stuffed elephant, Marcus walked through their apartment with a contractor's flashlight and a notebook. The cracks in the ceiling weren't settling marks. The gaps around the window frames weren't thermal expansion. The way the floor sagged near the bathroom meant joists undersized for the load they carried. He checked the building records on his laptop. Constructed 2019, owned by a shell company called Riverside Holdings, LLC. 3 clicks deeper into public records, Riverside Holdings was a subsidiary of Ashford Properties. His daughter slept 15 feet above a foundation he now recognized from his own inspection reports. The same pattern of structural compromise he documented and reported and watched disappear into administrative silence. The rage that built in his chest was the same rage he'd felt looking at case files of missing children, except this time his own child was sleeping in the evidence. Victoria Ashford's office occupied the entire 42nd floor of a building that bore her family's name in letters 10 feet tall. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that reduced people to the size of ants, which seemed appropriate given how she thought about them. Her CFO, a man named Peterson who'd perfected the art of moral flexibility, spread quarterly reports across her glass desk. Profit margins holding at 34% because we reduced structural costs by 18% across the low-income portfolio. Victoria studied the numbers with the focus she brought to everything, the same focus that had taken her father's moderately successful real estate company and turned it into an empire worth $600 million. The math was elegant. Nobody complained about building quality in neighborhoods where people were grateful to have housing at all. Code violations got buried under inspectors who understood that job security meant flexibility. The 4 deaths over 6 years were statistical noise, tragic but unactionable, the kind of thing insurance was designed to absorb. Her assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission. That inspector, Marcus Chen. He filed a formal complaint with the state licensing board about being removed from the Riverside project. Victoria pulled up Chen's file on her tablet. MIT, structural engineering, summa cum laude. FBI, 7 years, specialized in financial crimes and pattern analysis. Resigned 2022, no disciplinary record. She enlarged his photo, mid-30s, tired eyes, the kind of face that had seen things and decided to care anyway. Get me his supervisor's number. and find out if he has any vulnerabilities we can exploit. The assistant hesitated. Ma'am, he has a daughter, 8 years old. Single father, wife died 3 years ago. Victoria's finger paused over the screen. She thought about her own father, dead now for 5 years, who taught her that business was war conducted by other means. She thought about the photo on her desk, hidden in a drawer, of herself at 8 years old, before she'd learned that vulnerability was something people weaponized against you. Just get me the supervisor. Marcus spent the next 3 weeks in a rhythm that bordered on obsession. Mornings, he did his regular inspection rounds, documenting code violations with the same precision he'd learned at Quantico. Evenings, after Maya's homework and dinner, he built a case file that grew like a living thing. Rosa slipped him copies of old inspection reports that should have been destroyed, records from inspectors who'd retired under circumstances that started looking less voluntary the more he examined them. He interviewed 12 families across 6 different buildings, all Black or Latino, all living in structures that charged maximum rent for minimum safety. A grandmother who showed him cracks in her bedroom wall wide enough to fit his thumb. A young couple whose balcony had been condemned after their upstairs neighbors collapsed. A single mother whose ceiling leaked every time it rained because the roof membrane was half the specified thickness. The pattern wasn't just structural, it was racial, it was economic. It was a system that had learned to hide itself in plain sight by targeting people who lacked the resources to fight back. He found Davis, a retired inspector, living in a small house 2 hours outside the city. Davis was 73, arthritic hands wrapped around a coffee mug, eyes that had seen too much and stopped expecting better. They told me to pass Ashford buildings regardless of violations. I refused, filed complaints with my union, with the state board. 3 months later, my pension got audited for irregularities they never found, but investigating took 8 months. By the time I was cleared, I was too tired to fight anymore. Marcus recorded every word on his phone, backed up the audio to 3 different cloud services. Did anyone else refuse? 2 others. Both retired within a year. Both audited. The message was clear enough. Back in his apartment, Maya asleep in the next room, Marcus spread blueprints across their kitchen table next to actual construction photos he'd taken during inspections. The submitted plans showed rebar at 12-inch spacing. The photos showed 18-inch spacing, concrete specified at 4,000 psi, tested at 2,300, steel beams replaced with aluminum, fire-rated drywall swapped for standard, $47 million saved over 6 years by cutting corners that building codes existed to prevent, 4 deaths, 73 families living in structures that wouldn't survive the earthquake seismologists said was coming eventually. He pulled up the federal building code, cross-referenced it with HUD funding requirements. Every Ashford property in a low-income neighborhood had received federal development grants, which meant federal oversight, which meant federal violations. This wasn't just code enforcement anymore. This was fraud, conspiracy, possibly RICO predicates if he could prove the pattern was intentional and ongoing. Marcus drafted an email to his former FBI colleague, a woman named Rodriguez who'd moved to the Public Corruption Unit. He attached his analysis, his photos, his financial forensics showing how Ashford had systematically underbuilt while overcharging. His finger hovered over the send button. Sending this meant crossing a line from inspector to whistleblower. It meant painting a target on himself and possibly Maya. It meant Victoria Ashford would stop seeing him as a nuisance and start seeing him as a threat. He thought about the crack in Maya's ceiling, about the grandmother with her thumb in the wall, about Davis and his audited pension. He pressed send. The response came back in 4 minutes. Holy shit, Marcus. This is federal. Can you present to a grand jury? He typed, yes, but I need protection. I have a daughter. Rodriguez, we'll handle it. Keep gathering evidence. Don't let them know you've escalated. The next morning, Gerald called Marcus into his office with the expression of someone delivering news they'd been ordered to deliver and didn't agree with. Sit down. Marcus sat. Through the glass wall, he could see other inspectors pretending not to watch. There's been a complaint. Conflict of interest. You live in an Ashford-owned building, and you've been filing violation reports on Ashford properties. That's my job. Filing violation reports when I find violations. Gerald shifted papers on his desk without looking at them. The city attorney's office has recommended suspension pending ethics review. Paid leave, 2 weeks, while they investigate. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. Who filed the complaint? That's confidential, but we both know it came from Victoria Ashford's lawyers. Gerald finally met his eyes. I'm sorry, Marcus. I fought this, but they went over my head. Marcus stood, walked out through the office where every inspector suddenly found something fascinating on their computer screens. He drove home in midday traffic and sat in his car outside his building for 20 minutes before he could make himself go inside. Maya was at school. The apartment was silent except for the pipes groaning in the walls, the sound she'd asked about weeks ago, the sound he'd dismissed as normal because he'd wanted it to be normal. His phone rang. Blocked number. He answered anyway. Mr. Chen, this is David Morrison, counsel for Ashford Properties. Mrs. Ashford would like to resolve this situation amicably. We're prepared to offer $50,000 in exchange for your resignation and a non-disclosure agreement regarding any inspection findings. Marcus looked at the ceiling crack, at his bank account on his laptop showing $93, at the stack of bills on the counter that included a rent notice threatening eviction. No, the lawyer's tone didn't change. I'd encourage you to reconsider. Mrs. Ashford is prepared to make this offer once. If declined, we'll pursue all available legal remedies, including countersuit for defamation and malicious prosecution. I'm not for sale. Neither is my dignity. He hung up. His hands were shaking. He just turned down more money than he'd see in a year, turned it down for a case that might get him blacklisted from ever working in the city again. Maya came home 2 hours later, and he made her grilled cheese while she talked about a science experiment involving vinegar and baking soda. He listened and nodded and asked questions, and inside his chest was a war between the terror of what he'd started and the certainty that stopping now would kill something in him that mattered more than safety. That night, Rosa showed up at his door carrying a cardboard box that smelled like basement mildew and old paper. She set it on his kitchen table without being invited in. My granddaughter lives in one of those buildings. Ashford Terrace, Unit 4C. She's 5 years old. Rosa's eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been rage. I can't do what you're doing. I have 2 years until retirement, and I need the pension. But I can give you this. The box contained 30 years of inspection reports, photographs, internal memos, emails that should have been deleted but got archived instead. Evidence of a pattern that went back to Victoria's father, that she'd inherited and perpetuated and expanded. You didn't get this from me. I know. Rosa left. Marcus opened the box and started reading. By 3 a.m., he'd mapped a conspiracy that implicated not just Ashford Properties, but city commissioners who'd received campaign donations. building inspectors who'd accepted consulting contracts, a former HUD official who'd retired to the Bahamas after approving grants for buildings that violated the terms of their funding. This was bigger than he'd imagined, bigger than one company cutting corners. This was institutional corruption that had been running so long it had calcified into normal business practice. His phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. Stop digging, or your daughter's school records might get audited too. People lose custody over unpaid parking tickets. Marcus deleted the text, then wrote down the number and time received. Evidence of witness intimidation. Another federal crime to add to the list. He looked at Maya sleeping, at the files spread across his table, at the choice he'd already made without fully understanding its weight. Some battles you walked into knowing you might lose. Some you walked into knowing that not fighting would cost you something that couldn't be replaced by safety or money or peace. He opened a new document and began writing his formal complaint to the Department of Justice, 47 pages of evidence and analysis that took until sunrise to finish. The Department of Justice moved faster than Marcus expected and slower than he needed. Rodriguez called him on a Tuesday morning while he was making Maya's lunch, peanut butter and jelly because it was all they could afford until his suspension ended, if it ended. We're opening a formal investigation. Grand jury convenes in 6 weeks. Can you testify? Marcus watched Maya through the doorway, practicing multiplication tables at the kitchen table, her lips moving silently as she worked through problems. Yes, but I need witness protection protocols. My daughter can't be exposed. We'll arrange it. Marcus, this is going to get ugly before it gets better. Ashford has resources we don't. I know. He hung up and stared at his reflection in the microwave door, a tired man in a worn t-shirt who just committed to a fight that could destroy everything he had left. But doing nothing meant watching more balconies collapse, more roofs cave in, more families learning that their safety had been traded for profit margins in quarterly reports. The calculation wasn't complicated. It just wasn't easy. Victoria stood at her office window and watched the city spread below her like a game board she'd been winning for 12 years. Her phone buzzed with updates from her legal team. Chen had escalated to the DOJ. Chen had submitted 47 pages of analysis. Chen had recordings, photographs, financial forensics that would survive scrutiny. Peterson entered without knocking. We need to discuss containment strategy. She turned from the window. What do you recommend? Settle. Quietly. $80 million into a discretionary fund, distributed through intermediaries. Make the families whole. Make the violations disappear. Make Chen look like he's chasing ghosts. And if he doesn't accept, then we bury him in litigation until his daughter graduates college. We audit his taxes, his credentials, his FBI background. We turn him from whistleblower into someone with an axe to grind. Victoria looked at the photo hidden in her desk drawer. The one she'd taken out the night before and forgotten to put back. Herself at 8, standing next to her father outside their first development project. She remembered him explaining that business meant making hard choices, that sentiment was a luxury reserved for people who didn't build empires. Do it. But after Peterson left, she sat at her desk for an hour without moving, staring at the quarterly reports that showed profit built on calculations that treated human lives as acceptable risk. The city council hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Thursday that dawned cold and gray, the kind of morning that made the city look exactly as tired as it was. Marcus wore the only suit he owned, the one he'd bought for Sarah's funeral and hadn't touched since. Maya had helped him pick a tie, choosing blue because it matched his eyes. "Daddy, are you nervous?" "A little." "You're going to be great. You always are when you're helping people." He kissed her forehead and dropped her at school, watched her disappear through doors painted cheerful yellow that couldn't quite hide the decade of deferred maintenance. Then he drove downtown to a building where democracy happened in fits and starts, where justice occasionally showed up if you pushed hard enough and documented everything. The chamber filled slowly, news crews setting up cameras, lawyers in expensive suits forming defensive positions, citizens who'd come because Marcus had called them, had told them their stories mattered, had promised them that being heard was the first step toward being helped. Victoria arrived at 8:57, flanked by her legal team and wearing confidence like armor. She saw Marcus across the room, and something flickered in her expression, too quick to identify. Recognition, maybe. Or respect for an opponent who'd refused to be bought or intimidated into silence. The council chairman called the session to order. Victoria spoke first, her presentation polished and professional. Ashford Properties had invested $230 million in this city over 2 decades. They'd housed 12,000 families, created 800 jobs, revitalized neighborhoods that banks had written off as lost causes. She spoke for 15 minutes, and every word was technically true and fundamentally misleading. The kind of truth that omitted the parts that mattered most. Then it was Marcus's turn. He stood at the podium with his battered briefcase and connected his laptop to the projection system. The first slide showed 2 blueprints side by side, submitted versus actual construction for Ashford Riverside. Red circles highlighted where specifications had been ignored, where safety had been traded for savings. The second slide showed financial analysis. $47 million in structural cost reductions over 6 years, distributed across 73 buildings in neighborhoods where median income fell below $30,000 annually. The third slide showed photographs. A grandmother's bedroom wall with cracks wide enough for daylight. A balcony railing that had failed under load it should have supported. A roof that had collapsed during a storm because membrane thickness was half what code required. The fourth slide showed death certificates. 4 names, 4 dates, 4 lives that ended because someone had decided their safety was worth less than quarterly profit margins. Mrs. Ashford, you didn't just violate building codes. You violated the fundamental promise that structures are built to protect the people inside them. Victoria stood, her lawyer placing a restraining hand on her arm that she shook off. This is conjecture from a disgruntled employee who's been suspended for ethics violations. Marcus felt the words settle in his chest like stones, felt the weight of everyone in this room watching to see if he'd crack. I'm not disgruntled. I'm an MIT structural engineer with a graduate degree in forensic analysis. I'm a former FBI senior analyst who spent 6 months verifying every fact in this presentation. I'm a father who lives in one of your buildings and lies awake at night wondering if the ceiling will hold until morning. The room went silent. Victoria's lawyer whispered urgently in her ear, but she was staring at Marcus with an expression that might have been recognition or might have been the first crack in a wall she'd spent years building. And I'm not alone. Rodriguez stood up in the back of the room, her FBI credentials in hand. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez, Public Corruption Unit. We've been investigating Ashford Properties for 8 weeks based on Mr. Chen's initial findings. We've uncovered evidence of wire fraud, HUD grant misappropriation, and conspiracy to violate federal building safety standards. Victoria's face went pale. Her lawyers erupted in objections, but Rodriguez continued. We have recordings of bribes offered to city officials. We have documents showing systematic cost-cutting that violated the terms of federal funding. We have witness testimony from 12 former employees willing to testify about internal directives to ignore safety specifications. Marcus watched Victoria as the walls closed in, watched her calculate options and find them all leading to the same conclusion. She was smart enough to know when a fight was lost, pragmatic enough to cut losses before they became catastrophic. The chairman called for order, but the room had already descended into chaos. Reporters shouting questions, lawyers forming huddles, citizens who'd lived in Ashford buildings standing up one by one, bearing witness to what they'd endured and been told was normal. Victoria's lawyer leaned in close, said something that made her shoulders drop. She looked across the room at Marcus, and for the first time since this started, he saw her clearly. Not as a villain in a simple story, but as someone who'd inherited a system and lacked the courage to dismantle it until she had no choice. I inherited these practices from my father. That doesn't excuse my continuation of them. Her voice cut through the noise, silencing the room. I'll cooperate fully with the FBI investigation. I'll resign as CEO, and I'll establish an $80 million restitution fund for families affected by our violations. The chairman looked like someone had handed him a live grenade. Mrs. Ashford, you don't have to make statements without counsel present. I'm not making a statement. I'm accepting responsibility. She looked at Marcus again. You reminded me that some things matter more than profit. I'm sorry it took this long to remember. The council voted unanimously to revoke Ashford Properties permits and refer all findings to federal prosecutors. News crews scrambled for the exits, already writing headlines. Victoria walked out flanked by FBI agents who weren't there to arrest her yet, but the possibility hung in the air like smoke. Marcus packed his briefcase slowly, hands shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. Rosa appeared at his elbow. You did it. We did it. You, me, everyone who refused to accept that this was normal. He drove to Maya's school and picked her up early, drove to a park by the river where they'd scattered Sarah's ashes 3 years ago. Maya climbed on the jungle gym while Marcus sat on a bench and felt the weight of the last 6 weeks settle into his bones. His phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him. Mr. Chen, this is Director Williams from HUD's Office of Inspector General. We've reviewed your analysis of Ashford Properties. We'd like to offer you a position as senior investigator focusing on housing safety compliance. Marcus watched Maya swing from bar to bar, fearless and whole, living in a world he just made slightly safer. The offer meant stability, meant resources to do this work at scale, meant his daughter would grow up knowing her father chose justice over comfort. When can I start? 18 months later, Marcus stood in the same park with Maya, who'd turned 9 the week before and brought home straight A's and a science fair ribbon for a project about structural engineering. The restitution fund had relocated 73 families to safe housing. Chen's law required independent third-party inspections for all low-income developments. The DOJ had shut down 14 companies using similar schemes across 3 states. Victoria Ashford was across the park, wearing jeans instead of designer suits, volunteering with a homeless outreach program. She saw Marcus, raised a hand in acknowledgement that wasn't quite friendship, but maybe the beginning of mutual respect. Maya tugged his sleeve. Daddy, they offered you the director position. Are you going to take it? What do you think? I think you should help more people. That's what Mom would want. Marcus looked at his daughter, at the city stretching beyond the park, at all the buildings filled with people who deserved to be safe in their own homes. He thought about the grandmother with cracks in her wall, about Davis and his audited pension, about every person who'd been told their complaints didn't matter. Yeah, baby, I think you're right. They walked toward the parking lot as the sun broke through clouds, and Marcus carried with him the knowledge that systems only change when someone decides they're worth changing, that justice is just another word for giving a damn when it's easier not to.